So hi to everyone who is watching and listening. Welcome to my Culture Talks. It's a series of interviews with people from all over the world who are sharing their stories and experiences living and working abroad and talking about the differences and similarities between the countries they've lived in. So today I would like to welcome Michelle Bradley. Michelle is an intercultural trainer, consultant, group facilitator, language trainer, and translator. So we definitely have something or a few things in common, especially the passion for languages and cultures. She's bilingual in English and Mandarin Chinese and studies, I believe, traditional Chinese culture. So thank you, Michelle, for being my guest today.
Oh, Martina, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's lovely to be here.
So you currently live in Taipei, right? But as far as I know, you didn't grow up there. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, where did you grow up and why did you decide to live in Taipei?
Sure, my pleasure. So I was born in New York City, and we lived there until I was 7. Then we lived in London just for 1 year, and most of my education after that was in Cape Town, South Africa. So because my mother is from South Africa, my dad's from the States, I grew up in between those two countries mostly. Mm-hmm. And after finishing high school in Cape Town, I moved back to the US and I did my tertiary education first in Boston on the east coast of the US, and then on to Melbourne in Australia. So after seeing a little bit more of the world, I became very interested in Asia. And I went on to do yoga teacher training and yoga therapy training in India, which brought me to Japan, where I worked for a year, both as a teacher and as a yoga trainer. And then I just wanted to continue my dream. I had this dream of living and working in Asia, but it was really as broad as that. So I looked around and I found a job here in Taipei, and this was in 2007, not knowing anything about Taipei or the culture or the language, literally nothing. And I just arrived, and after a year, I realized that there was so much to learn, as well as an amazing language to study. So, that's, you could say that's how the story goes.
So, I mean, Chinese is not the easiest language, I've heard. And so how did you do in the beginning? I mean, was it very difficult to learn?
Chinese is interesting in that it's very different for us Westerners because the alphabet is so different. It's something that we haven't really connected with. So for us to begin and to understand the pictograph nature, it's a pictorial based language, is very challenging because we're used to having an alphabet and stringing words in the alphabet together. Whereas in Chinese, it's more about stringing images or concepts. So I would say that is the most difficult. So when you get over that hump, then you realize, oh, wow, there's like no past, present, or future, and there's no grammar to learn. And that is so much easier than English, as well as, a lot of the romantic languages, for example, French, is masculine and feminine with everything. None of that exists in Chinese. So I'd say the most difficult part is sort of understanding how to learn the characters and how to develop competency. And then once you have a base, like a foundation, it's actually surprisingly easy.
Okay. I've heard different stories.
Okay. The beginning is super hard. Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah.
But I think it's because, yeah. I think it's because of, like you said, like the pictographic language itself is just more complicated for us. I have a lot of Chinese students here also in Austria, and they try to learn German, which is very difficult because, as you said, you don't have the present, the future, or the past, or they don't have those articles, and it's quite difficult to conjugate then all of a sudden because it's something they haven't learned.
Yeah, that's the challenge. It's a very different sort of construct. Yeah.
So
but rewarding if you can get over it. Yeah.
So how long did it take for you to learn the language? I think you probably are still learning, but
yeah. Yes, I have class once a week, and I, on the side of my computer, there's lots of books and homework that I have to do. So, people sometimes ask me that, how long does it take to learn it? And my answer is it's definitely a continuous process. I think learning any language is very much like peeling the onion, like you peel one layer, like you reach a certain level and you worked really hard to get it. And then you have a higher level of competency. And then suddenly like you peel another onion and you realize, oh my goodness, there's so much more to learn. So it's definitely a lifelong journey. But, I was quite lucky because I also was able to make friends here quite quickly, and a lot of my coworkers would try to encourage me to speak Chinese. So I think after maybe 2 years of studying, I could have a conversation. Of course, much earlier than that, you can buy food or ask for directions, but I was having sort of simple conversations and making my way through understanding what people were saying after a couple of years. And then, it just becomes more and more part of you. So you don't consciously realize when you start to improve. And you always have a feeling that, when you only understand 30%, you feel maybe kind of proud of understanding 30%. But then when you can understand 80%, like that last 20% that you don't understand ends up feeling kind of frustrating. So it's very interesting.
I think that's the process of learning,
Yes.
Okay, you have 70% that you don't understand, you will get there. But when you have just a few words and you think like, oh my God, why is it not working? Why I can't, why do I not understand those words? Or you don't remember them. I think it's normal in any language.
Yeah, because there's a lot of idioms. Chinese has a lot of idioms. There are 4 characters, and these 4 characters strung together will often describe quite a deep concept. And they are sometimes used in daily life, and they're very useful because if you're able to say it, then you impart a much bigger and deeper meaning by using them. But, I have, pages and pages of idioms. And in real life, when you're faced in a situation, it's really hard to be like, oh, which idiom is like the perfect one to use in this moment, So sometimes they end up just staying in the book.
I think I know that feeling from the people who learn English or German here, that, we have a lot of idioms, but you get to a certain point, like a C2 level, when you learn the language and you're just stuck there, or you need to learn the dialect or something like this. Is the language necessary to really feel home in Taipei? Like that you feel comfortable enough, or that you can dive into the culture even more?
So if we take those 2 concepts, to feel comfortable and then dive into the culture, I'd say to feel comfortable, it's not necessary, because people here are very accommodating. There's kind of this phenomenon that you face. You walk into a shop and then you see the person at the front desk kind of shaking, and they're looking at you approaching them, and then you hear them and they like run to the back and they'll say in Chinese, they'll be like, there's a foreigner in front and I can't speak English. Can you help me? And then they push the person that speaks the best English to the front, and everyone else is like, what are they going to say? So it's very sweet in the sense that there's this sense here that people should accommodate the international community and speak English to them. So I have friends, I know many people who live here, who've been here 20 years, 30 years, and they can just get by with a couple of phrases because everyone is very willing to meet them where they are. However, in terms of going deeper into the culture and understanding the values that drive behaviors, I would say that it's crucial. So if you really want to understand, why things are done the way they're done, or what is the meaning behind the words, or if you want to, become an entrepreneur or like work in a more locally based company, things like this. If you want to integrate more into society, then I would say that language acquisition is very necessary. However, if you want to stay more in like a sort of an expat bubble, then it's not very necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting description with the expat bubble, because that happens a lot. If you don't stay that long, or you're not planning to stay longer or really live abroad, then you stay in this bubble and you simply go on. You travel to a different country and that's it. Yeah. So
Yeah.
but I think sometimes it would be nicer to to understand the people a little bit better, and also the values and where they come from and their background, so that you leave with a more, I don't know, with more background information.
Yes, I definitely agree, Martina. Especially because, well, it depends where you're from. But for example, let's take one of my backgrounds, the United States. The United States is considered to be what we call a very low context culture, in the sense that a lot of meaning is used by the words that are chosen. So the words equal the meaning, and things are very explicit. What people mean is said very clearly. Maybe not as direct as, for example, Germany or Holland, but it's still considered to be quite straightforward. In New York, where I'm from, time is money.
Yeah.
Whereas here, it's the opposite. It's what we call, of course, you know this, but just for everyone's sake, it's a high context culture. So a lot of meaning needs to be deciphered by feeling. And so sometimes the words that are used don't directly express what the intention is. And sometimes it's directly translated. It's like a Chinese language, and then it's filtered into English. And by the time it reaches English, logically, it's very hard to grasp what the meaning is. And so sometimes to describe it, it's more like you have to feel it rather than listen to it. So I think it really helps to get that sort of more abstract and less literal interpretation and understanding through the language, because the language is constructed that way. Yeah, so there's one term that is in Chinese, which is called, for those of you who speak Chinese, you'll know it, it's called 不好意思. And sometimes my clients or students will ask me, oh, how can we translate that into English? And my first question is, in what situation? In what situation are we using it? Because depending on the context, it could have similar but fairly different translations into English. So it's very interesting.
There are a lot of concepts in China that are completely different to the Western world. So
Yes.
I know that you've also mentioned, and I'm hoping that I pronounce it correctly, which is
Sure.
renjing. So can you tell maybe the listeners and the people who are watching what Chinese people understand under the word renjing?
So this is like talking about human relationships, and human relationships directly translated into English, that sounds like, oh, a logical thing. We have relationships with other humans. So in Chinese culture, we have to go back. We have to think about it as, oh, this is like a 6,000-year-old culture. And there are many influences that affect people now today. maybe even without them realizing it, that come from historical influences. So one of our most important characters from Chinese history is Confucius. So Confucius lived and wrote more than 2,500 years ago. And what he talked about, okay, let me backtrack. The period of time that he lived in China was a period of great unrest. And there were many small warring states that were warring and fighting with each other to gain supremacy. So it was a time of great instability. There was a time of uncertainty about, livelihood, of length of life, and also of trust of your ruler and of your society. So many scholars at that time, it was a time that was very rich in scholarly and philosophical thought. And many philosophers tried to find ways to address the needs of humanity. And what Confucius focused on were the structure of society to create a peaceful, structure based on human relationships, so that everybody knew their place and that everything was kind of part of like a greater order. So it was basically, it's called like the five relationships. And for those who are listening, if you want to go into more detail, you can Google like Confucius, the 5 relationships. But basically it means that in any given situation, there is a clear sort of way of thinking about how, for example, the ruler and the subject, or the boss and the employee, or the spouse, the husband, traditionally the husband and the wife, now you could just say like the 2 partners, and then also the siblings, and then also friends. So within that structure, it's very clear, like if you're looking up or you're looking down, and then what role you play. And these roles help everybody to put less emphasis on themselves. So it's less of an individualistic culture, and it's more collectivist, where everyone kind of has a role in society. And the focus is on, Confucius mentioned like peace or harmony in yourself, and then peace in the family, and then that can extend to the society, and then finally that can extend to the ruler. So the focus, was on sort of peace and societal harmony. So that idea, of course, has changed and evolved over time. However, that basic underlying foundational concept still definitely applies to modern life. Yeah.
I mean, now that you mentioned the individualistic and collectivistic, when you think of the countries you've been to or where you grew up, what is the biggest difference? So what did you notice immediately when you moved to these different countries?
Growing up as a child, you just kind of take things as natural. So it's hard to say that I noticed anything growing up somewhere, because it was just sort of, oh, this is where I live, or this is where I am. But I remember kind of as an adult, when I started coming out to the East more, whether it was in Japan, India, or the greater China. Of course, there are massive differences in Asia, Indian culture, Thai culture, Vietnamese culture, Japanese culture, they're all very different. However, there is one thing that I noticed that came up again and again, was more of a sense of duty. Duty being that, the decisions that you make, when you make decisions about your life, where you live, what your job's going to be, even, what you're going to eat for dinner, what you're going to do over the weekend. In this part of the world, there is more of a consideration for how will my actions or how will my behavior affect the other people around me that I care about or that I work with. And that's something for me, of course, there's many people who care about what other people think in the West. So don't get me wrong, but I think it's a matter of emphasis. And I found it interesting about how much emphasis there was on that. And especially in Chinese cultures or cultures that were influenced by Confucian thought, which includes, all of Northeast Asia, Korea, Japan, there is a duty. This word duty is very central to how people think about their actions and think about their lives. Whereas in the US, this word duty doesn't really feature as prominently. And this one concept affects everything, really everything. Yeah, yes.
So what kind of advice would you give people that travel to Taipei or China or any country that base their values on Confucius?
I would say if you are traveling, just come with an open mind and try to observe your communication, your interaction, as well as what you experience, and use an open mind, or step back from the situation and try to observe what you see before responding with an opinion. Because sometimes if you just immediately respond with an opinion, then you lose the beauty of going deeper into something that is unknown. So this is my approach now, even after so many years. I basically, in my daily life, I try to suspend judgment, and I focus on more like a wider view observation. And sometimes, things that happen to me or conversations that I had many years ago, they only really make sense to me years later. and in some situations at the beginning, my responses or how I viewed situations, I now look back and I realize, oh, if I'd known what I do now, I would have seen that situation so much differently. And I think also it's very important to realize that because it's more of a collective-based culture, there's less of a focus on privacy, which for a lot of North Americans and Western Europeans is very important. As of course, other regions in the world, but that's just two areas that I'm more familiar with personally. So I would suggest if someone asks you a very personal question the first time that you meet them, don't get offended, because they're not trying to intrude. They're really not. They would never be rude. Being rude or offending someone is the last thing anybody would do over here. So if you do feel offended, or you do feel like your privacy isn't being respected, please remember that actually that's the way that they're trying to show what we call 关心, which means that they're trying to show that they're caring about you and they're interested in establishing a relationship or a friendship with you. So you just have a lighthearted approach to, maybe being asked things that you would be really shocked about in your own country. Yeah, and in terms of long-term, if you want to move here, or you're doing business, or your spouse is going to come over to this part of the world and you're going to join them, I highly suggest reading as much as you can, taking some language courses, and applying all the advice that I just mentioned previously too.
So in your opinion, a little bit of preparation is necessary to not be too much surprised when you get there, right?
Yeah, I think as much preparation as you're willing to put in is definitely going to be well received. You'll benefit from it greatly, and you might find it easier to interact and to get around, for sure.
And also the relationships that you mentioned, or building up the trust, is quite important in China, or also Asian countries. But also here in Europe, there are some countries that it's very important to establish that trust first before even doing business with someone or trying to negotiate. So I think that's a very good advice, that you just don't be too shocked when they are too direct in a way that we might not be used to here. Also in Austria, I mean, we do a lot of small talk, of course, but it's until a certain point, you know, where you get to know that person better, we get or ask more personal questions. So it's it takes a bit more time, I think, than in China. That's for sure. When it comes to doing business with China, or in Taipei, what is the most important thing that you have to be aware of?
When in Rome, do as the Romans do. What does that mean, really? You know, if you don't know what the Romans do. So I think it really depends on the industry. You know, like if you're in more of an entrepreneurial scene, or in sort of media, fashion, advertising, it's going to be really different from if you're in the financial sector or like the legal sector. So depending on your industry, how hierarchical the organization is going to matter a lot. But I think one point that is very important to remember is that if it is more of an established traditional company, respect and a lot of emphasis on showing that respect is very important for the CEO, the boss, or whoever the top person is in the meeting, or in the the chat, or in the email group. So if you're going into a meeting, traditionally, this is also different. You know, if you're working with a sort of a younger, more entrepreneurial group, it could be completely different. But traditionally, if you're going into a meeting, there's going to be like a long table, and usually the most senior person will be sitting at the end of the table, and his or her body will be facing the door, and their back will be towards the back wall. So even like the placement, the position of the spots and where everyone sits, it will go down in order in terms of hierarchy. But usually, your direct contact, or the person that you'll be speaking to, would not be that senior boss. Usually it will be the vice president or their assistant. And you'll know very quickly who it is, because that person, you know, usually they'll assign someone who speaks, you know, very good English, or very good German, or whatever the language that you're speaking. And they'll be the one who's directly going into communication with you. So I think that's the first point, is to pay attention to being respectful. And then the second point that I think is useful is to remember that meetings usually, as I said, it could depend on the industry, but the point of a meeting usually is not to get all the details down and to sign the deal. The point of the meeting usually is to feel out the other side and to communicate. And in the details of the contract or of the deal or whatever you're moving forward with will be discussed privately by the people that you're meeting with after the meeting. So if you have a sense of, oh, this meeting is very much like a direct process where my goal is to walk out with a confirmed yes and a contract, you might end up feeling frustrated. So instead, I think you can maybe just take a step back and focus on following their lead a little bit, and focus on relationship building. Because if it goes well, then that relationship that you're establishing with this other party or company could be very long-lasting, long-term, not just only that contract. So I would say have patience and realize that maybe even some of the points or some of the details that you have discussed and they seemed to agree to in the meeting might not be necessarily an agreement, rather than just an acknowledgement of your opinion. So take it slowly and let the process be more like water. It's like water flowing, and it's moving in different directions. It'll finally get to the ocean, but it's it's not going to be like one straight line. Yeah, so that would be something that I would find very helpful to have known so many years ago.
I think that this might be quite tricky for some countries because they're very straightforward, also like the US, that they want to sign the deal and get everything done in one meeting, which is not going to happen in China or in Taipei, I think, in general, or in any Asian cultures, because it just takes a lot more time to build trust and relationships. So keep that in mind to all the listeners and for those watching out there.
Can I add one point to that, Martina? Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I think also you need to remember that it depends on what your relationship is based on. If your relationship is based on what we call 关系, it means that maybe you were introduced by a friend, or you've worked with someone who used to be in another company and then has moved to another company, then the process is going to be sped up considerably. But if this is more of a new relationship and they're not so familiar, then it will go slower. So there's an expression that I'll just say in Chinese. It's 有关系没有关系, which basically means if there is that relationship established, then there are no issues, or there are no problems. So I think it's also very important to look at any kind of situation based on what is the relationship that we are currently founded on. And then from there, you'll know much more clearly how things are going to proceed.
I think that's applicable to any culture almost. Like when you get to know the person better, it's much easier, the whole process.
Yeah.
But you probably know just as well as I do, that some might not need that kind of deeper relationship to have to sign the contract, because it's just simply not necessary to do business.
Yeah. It's certainly not in the US.
All right. So for those who are interested in reaching out to you, how do they get in contact with you? Where do they find you?
The name of my consulting company is called Elephant Communications. So you can find my website at elephantcommunications.com. Then also I'm on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is simply my name, which you can see on the screen, Michelle Bradley. And also on Facebook, there's a Facebook group called, I have a Facebook wall called Elephant Communications TW. So you can check me out there. And if you want to email me, I'm at contact@elephantcommunications.com.
Perfect. So to all the listeners and for those watching, now you know how to contact Michelle. If you don't find her, just contact me and I will pass it on to her. But thank you, Michelle, for taking the time today and sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and of course your knowledge with the listeners. It was a real pleasure talking to you about that. And of course, thank you all out there for watching. If you like to know more about other cultures, intercultural training, or expert training, please send me a message or an email, and we can talk about details on how I can help you and your team improve your communication across cultures. And if you like what you hear, follow our Culture Talks and share it with others. So talk soon.